problem of academics and also of, especially of architects, that that we don't experience necessarily the things that we are talking about. And if we were experiencing them, why would we need to talk about them? So when you're in a congress about architecture, and many of you are architecture students, even before we begin, our relationship to the word architecture is very complicated. And when you're in a room like this, it's even more complicated. So it's not just that we are not going to see Belgrade. It is in no way that we will be in Belgrade during the time of this congress. We are almost as far away from Belgrade as it is possible for you to be. So then the question is, why have all of us in this room decided to leave Belgrade so aggressively and to go so deeply into this question of the relationship of architecture and philosophy? For me, of course, it's kind of reunion. It has something of this festivity about it, and it's really great, I think, to be here talking about the legacy of Derrida in architecture. It's a very long time since I was talking about Derrida, so I really appreciate the invitation to try to understand why I have not been talking about Derrida. I haven't talked about Derrida for a long time, so it is as if I have left him behind. And that would be my first question. What would it be to leave Derrida behind? With all of the risks of this question and its implication that I have been moving forward, and therefore I left him behind, and that he is no longer moving. It seems to me this is a super risky desire that I am moving forward, or even that I imagine that other people are also moving forward with me, that architecture has a kind of movement, that it is a movement, and that it has a front, and because it has a front, somebody could be behind, in this case a philosopher. So, and by the way, if there was a front, a leading edge, a front to architecture as a discipline, how could I possibly know that I was at the front? Like, what would it be to know that you're at the front? If I'm at the very front, I see only what is in front of me. So I actually don't know that I'm at the front. So to know that you are at the front, you actually have to be not at the front, slightly behind the front, and see someone else who you believe to be at the front. You have to, as it were, look over the shoulder of somebody and see that they are at the front. So actually anybody at the front cannot know that. So it's possible Derrida is still at the front, looking over our shoulders. This was not... I mean, I appreciate his signals, but I prefer some light, if I could have some light. Thank you. Okay, so... So I want to ask this. I want to try to explain why I have not used the name Derrida for so long. It was a fantastic introduction, I thought. I'm still thinking about the questions you raised and the name and the call. Of course, the organizers of the conference, in a way, one architect, one philosopher, very symmetrical, say in the text of the conference that, quote, the conference will be directed towards defining whether a new kind of unease has emerged in the contemporary relations between the two disciplines, architecture and philosophy. So maybe we are uneasy with each other. But I noticed that most of the speakers come from the side of architecture, if we can speak of architecture as a side, which is, by the way, already, to take the architectural point of view of a side of something. And there are 12 of us, which doesn't seem to be accidental at all. So maybe less of a kind of reunion and more of a kind of a wake in honor of Derrida's thought, or even a kind of retroactive Last Supper with the 12 of us talking to you, and you given the opportunity to try to imagine which of us, or all of us, are betraying the absent philosopher. It's anyway, if it's the Last Supper, it's a kind of a feast, a symposium in the original Greek sense, a lot of drinking and eating. We already started last night, I have to say. So much more relaxed and much more of a pleasure. So again, thank you so much for the invitation. And actually the fact that this is a feast or a symposium is really good for me because I don't really have a detailed and prepared argument. I'm not going to make any close readings. I'm just going to stay on the surface with a few personal reflections. By the way, does this lack of preparation already place me on the side of the architects? Would philosophy be bound to be very well prepared? Am I being more architectural by being less philosophical? Should, by the way, the architects speaking today sound like philosophers? Is that what we should be doing if we are engaging in the subject? Should we reanalyze the relationship between architecture and philosophy philosophically? Should this be our way of thinking about that relationship? Or should we just make a drawing of that relationship? In other words, using our own tools, as it were, describing the geometry of the relationship between architecture and philosophy, and supposedly we are good with geometry. It is, when you think this, as if the structuring of objects is on our side, the architect's side, and the structuring of words is on the side of philosophy. So for the philosophers will be careful with words, and we will be careful with the drawing. And if our drawing is very good, we can be loose with the words. And if the philosophers' words are very clear, they can make also a drawing without embarrassment. And it's not so simple, of course, because for us, for our field, the drawing is classically defined as that which is neither simply an object or an idea, but is a kind of half object that allows ideas and objects to be combined. So classically, the drawing is the shadow of a shadow. It is the shadow of an idea. It is what an idea would be if it was material, and it is the beginning of the possibility of the material world being inhabited by ideas. In this sense, we could say that through the drawing, architecture is quite literally filled with words, even overflowing with words. By the way, it's also true for philosophy, that philosophy is filled with objects. But these are not objects that have been carefully analyzed. These are not objects subjected to philosophical scrutiny. These are images of objects that shape and drive the analysis. We could even say that philosophy is filled with drawings, in the same way that architecture is filled with words. So this simple thought that we have, that architecture is on the side of objects and philosophy is always on the side of ideas, places architecture as object in the position of that which will be analyzed. In other words, the position of the philosopher will be to examine the objects of the architect. In other words, our field is, as it were, incomplete without analysis. We, in a way, wait for words. We ask for words. I love the idea of the call. We call for the words. We call to be subordinated to philosophy. We invite the condemnation and analysis of philosophy. And in the most classical of positions, philosophy almost always looks down at objects. When you think you have an idea, you look up. There is such a strong architecture to the image of ideas as coming down. And therefore, we, so close to the object, are down, waiting to receive this, as it were, a gift from above. And we call for this. In other words, we ask to remain below. We await the domination of the word. We seek legitimation from the higher authority of philosophy. Could you say so easily, the higher authority of architecture? No, it's not so easy. You think there's some sort of trick. But if you say the higher authority of philosophy, everybody says, oh yes, they're very serious in philosophy. And this higher authority of philosophy, in turn and in reverse, seeks evidence. You could even say evidence of evidence, the making evident of ideas in architecture. So for philosophy, we act as a special case of the evidence that ideas could be in the world, acting in the world. Philosophy is, in a certain sense, embarrassed by architecture, yet dependent upon it. You could even say embarrassed by its dependence. Philosophy cannot be itself without this gesture towards architecture, a gesture which it is not, in the end, very comfortable with. So I think, of course, from our side, it's very important to remember that architecture can never be a set of objects, but is a theory about what objects can be. The world is not filled with architecture waiting for us to analyze it. Architecture is a concept. It's a way of seeing the world. So it is a way of understanding the world. The world has, as it were, no need of architecture. Architecture is always beyond need. So if architecture is a way of studying things, not a set of objects, then the issue is not so simply the world of the objects of the architect and the world of the words of the philosopher, but two modes of study, two ways of looking and thinking, each somehow dependent on the other. So for me the question here is much less the legacy of Derrida in architecture than the legacy of architecture in philosophy. So to be faithful then, to be faithful to the text of Derrida, faithful to the words, by the way, should we continue to read them? If I were to be reading a philosopher a lot and then stop reading that philosopher, have I lost faith with the philosopher? Am I no longer thinking in and through that philosopher? Would it be that to be faithful to the text of Derrida you have to keep reading him and reading itself and writing in and through this reading, since this is the nature of his writing? The idea that somehow architecture is less deconstructive, if we can say that, because the name of Derrida appears less in recent years, seems so unimpressive, so uninteresting as a hypothesis, and so disrespectful to his thinking. The thought that only in the name of Derrida, quite literally the name, would his thinking operate. Can't we argue even the reverse, that one could only be faithful to his text by precisely no longer reading them? Indeed, could one only be faithful in, as it were, giving space to those texts, taking distance from them, not in a gesture of denial or betrayal, but a refusal to take disingenuously a kind of a subservient position, to continue to pretend that you are below those texts, underneath those texts, awaiting the wisdom of those texts. Surely, to take the position that your thinking only can be taken seriously if it remains subordinate to the writings of Derrida is the clumsiest of insults to the work, to those texts. The architect, of course, is supposed to be embarrassed in reading philosophy. And we are, by the way. We're supposed to feel inadequate in the face of very precise arguments. And we are, by the way, very embarrassed. We are smiling at you here. I am right now, but it's not good. It's not good. Yet the sort of highly disciplined philosopher feels no guilt when speaking about architecture. On the contrary, the philosopher speaks with all the confidence of a colonial power, mastering the object. It's evident. Philosophy sweeps its way through architecture with such a kind of calm, a sort of a splendid calm. Of course, those of us from the colonies, Derrida too, of course, but those of us from the colonies know that the apparent confidence of the colonizer is the very symptom of the great fear of the other. The lack of guilt and embarrassment that philosophers show in the face of architecture masks a kind of troubled relationship to architecture. The voice of authority, any voice of authority itself is always inhabited by and dependent on what it fears the most. So philosophy might be actually super unsure and super uneasy in the face of architecture. Or another way to say this is that its relationship to architecture is precisely not philosophical. In other words, philosophy in its routine operations maintains a very particular relationship to architecture, which is not like the relationships that it treasures the most. But it depends upon them. It could be that architecture operates within philosophy as a kind of essential and yet unexamined image. And the lack of examination of that image would be embarrassing to philosophy, but it is not willing, not interested, nor could it even conceive of itself as being able to analyze that image. That is to say, if there is an image of architecture upon which philosophy is absolutely dependent for its operations, but unable to see, You cannot simply invite philosophy to see this thing and remain philosophy. It is the two arguments are completely linked. If philosophy is dependent on a particular image and that image is not examined, philosophy cannot ever examine that image, and it's not an image in which anyway there is or could be some kind of secret philosophical truth that could enhance or enrich philosophy in its operations. In the case of Derrida's writing, I think there is a tendency for most of the readers of Derrida to go from his text to some object of study. In other words, he's treated as a kind of infinite source of wisdom about pretty much anything. His texts are ascribed a kind of unlimited authority. His writing is seen to open any door in any field. It's really hard to imagine a question that you might consider an important question that Derrida's writing would not be seen to be an appropriate way of thinking about it. And there is therefore a temptation to treat architecture as yet one more object in a very long line of objects which would be enriched by Derrida's thought. But it's really not so simple, since architecture is also the caretaker of the idea of an object. In other words, it's not just that architecture is a set of objects. In fact, as I was saying to you before, it's precisely not a set of objects, but a way of seeing objects. But this particular way of seeing objects has within it the very idea of objecthood. In other words, the architect, the small role that architects play in our society is to preserve a certain image of what an object can be, that image being extraordinarily important to philosophical thinking. And by the way, this kind of concept of the object that is protected and preserved in the architectural field, an object is always exactly that, a concept. Objects are never simply waiting to be analyzed, as I was saying before. The very sense of an object, the name object, is already the effect of analysis. You cannot avoid this. Or to say it another way, our world is not simply filled with objects that we would choose to analyze. Architecture as a set of objects that perhaps represent objecthood itself, prop up the workings of theory as a very, very special case. So in this sense, one wouldn't apply necessarily the thinking of Derrida to architecture in the way you would in other fields. There would be an asymmetry to it, or at least there would be a need for an elaboration or a kind of extended thinking. So to be faithful to Derrida's thinking does not mean endlessly rereading his work, nor applying that work to buildings. In fact, that would be perhaps the last thing one would do. To be faithful would be, in this sense, to keep thinking, to keep questioning assumptions, to keep looking at how it is that authority is constructed. And when I say this, it may sound to you like an elaborate kind of rationalization or defense for why it is that I myself don't or have not been referring to the name and work of Derrida in recent years. But I want to insist that this is anyway, which is true by the way, but it's not a new position on my part. This is not some sort of post-Derridian argument. It's certainly not a symptom of some kind of post-theory. It's certainly not the kind of hypocritical theory of the post-theory, which has always been quite a strong one in architecture. It's true that I wrote a few essays in a book about Derrida's thinking, but I almost never lectured about it. This is in this sense a super exception here today. Nor did I ever give classes about it, and I'm a teacher, basically. And I've never included it on any reading list. Only once in the last 25 years did I succumb to a student that I particularly liked, his demand that we should read one of Derrida's texts in a class, and it was, of course, the Archive Fever text for a group of PhD students who were hoping, of course, that this text, Archive Fever, would unlock for them the nightmare of what it is to be doing a PhD. Didn't work. And even when writing about Derrida, I never found the need to use terms like difference, metaphysics of presence, and so on. Like much of the key concepts were I never could speak or felt the need to, or the ability, or the desire, or the expertise to use those terms. There were just a few essays that went into a book and came out of a book that had more or less the same title as this conference, although I noticed that you have now changed the subtitle. It is now The Spectre of Jacques Derrida rather than Derrida's Haunt. Surely this, it's more about the ghost of Derrida than Derrida as a ghost, you could say. Surely, or hopefully, this change is not a question of Derrida's passing or of the absence of the philosopher. It is not the death of Derrida that makes him more ghostly at all. As if, by the way, we would imagine that his thinking would be different after his death. Or simply afterwards. Or even just a little bit later. If you would imagine that, as it were, philosophy, if you take a deep breath, is something else after that breath. As if the effect of Derrida was understood at the time when he was writing, and now we are in some other moment. Surely you could argue the opposite, that Derrida is much less of a spectre now than he was at the time that he was writing. And anyway, Derrida was never simply present in architecture. If you could, anyone ever be simply present in architecture. Let's say this more personally. I encountered his writing from a very great distance in a used bookstore in New Zealand, probably in 1983. I was attracted to a book that had, this was on the inside of the book. It was, of course, Gayatri's translation of grammatology. And there was a small newspaper clipping glued into the front of the book, which is discussing Derrida's arrest in Prague towards the end of 1981, where he was in prison for about 3 days, with the false accusation of dealing drugs, or perhaps he was dealing drugs, by the way, but he says no. And I was attracted to this. Why would it be that any philosopher, their work would be sufficiently interesting that they should be falsely arrested? And why is it that a philosopher would be giving a philosophical seminar in the home of a human rights activist? In other words, everything about this story made me interested in this person, and even the fact that a New Zealand report on this arrest, the fact that such a phenomenon would be reported in a not very impressive newspaper in New Zealand, and that somebody would have cut out that piece of paper and glued it into their copy, made me super interested, but also that person would then have sold the book back to the bookstore. So somebody would be so fascinated, so deeply interested, and then so sort of disinterested. So I bought it for $5.95, as you can see there. And why I was looking at the philosophy shelf of this bookstore, and I can see that shelf very clear in my mind, I'm not certain. And why I bought this particular one, I'm not certain either, but friends of mine who were studying anthropology down the street where I was living were very interested in Derrida, and when I said I found this interesting book, they said, oh yeah, this is a very interesting person, so I started to read. And in some ways, very similar to what Jeff was saying, I have had this experience, and maybe you too, that you imagine that one day you would meet somebody and you would very much enjoy that relationship. So you, in a way, imagine someone, and then you meet them. When you meet them, that's the person that I've been dreaming about. This is the sort of relationship. We could, again, have a conference on why it is that Derrida was able to produce this effect in his writing, this extraordinarily complex writing that people, very technical writing also, that people would believe when they read it that this is what they had been already thinking. So why is it that Derrida was able to produce the sense that he was right, and not only that he was right, but that you already were thinking in that very way? Anyway, some kind of, for me, resonance with questions that were very specific to architecture, as if the very geometry of his arguments resonated with certain architectural questions. Immediately, for me, the issue was not how would his thinking relate to architecture, how could it be applied to architecture, but why was it that architecture was so obviously playing a huge role in the organization of his thinking. And of course this was what I was trying to do in the PhD, is understand why such an interesting thinker depended on architecture, in which way the argument was already architectural. The feeling of writing that dissertation at such a great distance was like writing a letter that I never intended to send. It was very, very evident to me that I was writing about arguments that were formulated 1965, 66, 67. This was already historical arguments, and I had no reason to imagine that the field itself of philosophy was still interested in those particular arguments in that particular way, and I never imagined that architecture would be at all interested in them, and if they had been, I would have assumed that they had moved on. So basically I felt myself to be literally on the beach where I was writing the PhD, imagining that I was writing about some moment of the 1960s that was extraordinarily interesting to me personally because of my various psychological problems. Of course eventually I discovered that architecture also was filled with psychological problems, and the only reference that I knew to Derrida's work actually came in a footnote to an article in the first issue of the magazine Oppositions. And in an article by Diana Agrest and Mario Gandelsonis, is a reference of grammatology, precisely, and it's an incredibly stupid footnote. It is so not about grammatology, but nevertheless the name is there. And so it occurs to me it's possible, and it's an excellent article with a terrible footnote. And again, it's somehow reassuring to me that something strong and solid would be propped up based on sloppy footnotes, uneasy footnotes. And perhaps it's because there was this not very good footnote that when I saw that book on the bookshelf, I reached for it, but since I had already heard the expression of grammatology, and maybe then I saw this clipping. So perhaps I am indebted to Agrest and Gandelsonis' argument, which was an Althusserian argument about the possibility of theory in architecture. By the time I finished doing the PhD, something extraordinarily strange and for me enormously embarrassing occurred, which is that Derrida started to write about architecture as distinct, and was invited to by an architect, Bernard Schumi, in 1985, and then started to work with Eisenman with the collaboration in the Choral Works and so on. And this delay, this fact that a very, very precise argument from the late 1960s had such a resonance in architecture 20 years later is consistent with Derrida's own observation that perhaps nothing is more on the side of metaphysics than architecture. That is to say, it was inevitable that eventually, and probably last, architecture would be the subject for investigation, even a kind of compliment to this delay, that we would finally be the question. And at the time, by the way, there were endless articles published on the fact that it's just unbelievable that deconstruction is considered in architecture. At the time, the American university was understood to have been destroyed by French post-structuralist thinking, and the evidence that was offered for that was that schools of architecture were reading deconstruction. This was finally the proof that nothing was sacred. Because again, if architecture is the caretaker of a concept of objecthood, that too would fall was totally unacceptable. I, by the way, was not very interested in those experiments, and I'm still not interested in them, although I welcome everybody to try to persuade me again today. I really didn't think it was interesting for there to be a kind of therapeutic showdown, a kind of celebrity death match between some good architects and some good philosophers, kind of gladiators who are also lovers, is the sort of model. It would be a good film, perhaps. I'm not convinced that a deep dance of architecture and philosophy produces anything new, either for architecture or philosophy. In fact, everything that I would say would tend to say the opposite. I'm much more interested in what is always already happening, both in architecture and in philosophy. That is to say, architecture in its normal mode of operation and philosophy in its normal mode of operation are considerably more weird and more experimental and more unimaginable than that very theatrical series of encounters. The Museum of Modern Art show in 1988 was precisely not about the application of Derrida to architecture as a kind of state-of-the-art gesture, but it was an exploration of the state-of-the-art in the dance of structure and ornament. And the argument was very simply made that that work in which the line between structure and ornament cannot be drawn produces a kind of unease, and this unease is as old as architecture itself. So the argument being made there is that a set of contemporary architects are continuing to kind of work on the question, the line of structure and ornament, and precisely unease is the word used by the catalogue essay to explain the effect of the loss of the line, a clear line between structure and ornament, particularly where structure is associated with orthogonal geometry. We could say it even more simply, just simply the right angle. The real crime of this exhibition was to have reduced the entire history of architecture to a question about the right angle. And I find myself here in front of you today feeling like either that is just the most exhilaratingly brilliant reduction possible, or the single most embarrassing gesture one could imagine, and it's probably both. But what I'm terribly afraid about is that it was right. That actually the right angle, often referred to as normal, is the single most astonishing artifact that our species has produced. And it's an artifact about which the architect, the caretaker, let's say, of the right angle, and the philosopher, the caretaker of the thinking about such things, I don't think the right angle is yet to, as it were, be fully exposed. So the argument being made in the exhibition in 1988 was not that this is the architecture which was produced out of the theory of deconstruction, but it was identifying certain enigmas in architecture that would be of interest to deconstruction if deconstruction would start to think about architecture. The PhD and the exhibition immediately afterwards were completely different, although there is a point of intersection, a hinge between them. For me, the same labor of thinking that I was doing before finding this book continued after the PhD, after the exhibition and after the book, continues in the research and continues even now in the shaping of an architecture school without the name of Derrida being voiced, and yet, in my opinion, remaining utterly faithful to the thinking. The proper name of Derrida, and can we say it, the improper name deconstruction, do not make your work more deconstructive, if we can say that. Indeed, it could be argued that precisely the use of the word Derrida and the use of the word deconstruction make something less so. Words are, of course, inserted precisely and confidently in those places to produce a sense of action and certainty in exactly those places where there is uncertainty and lack of action. If one is making an argument, I'm sorry for the clumsiness of what I'm saying, but if you're making an argument that is deeply engaging with the philosophy of Derrida, why would his name be necessary to indicate that this is in fact Derrida's thinking that you were working on? You use the name because there's the possibility that you could be describing to catch the specificity of his thinking. So as long as his name remains, you're also alerting the reader to the fact that you are not yet sure that you have grasped the thinking that you are naming, the thinking of Derrida. Or to say it another way, you could leave Derrida's thinking behind by using his name. In other words, the more you use it, the less you are reading. And quite the opposite. You can stay with the thinking precisely not by using the name. The question of legacy, in this case the legacy of Derrida, is always very, very complex. The true legacy, if one can say that, is precisely that which is not named but lives on. Right? So the legacy is not that which is called legacy, but that which survives, that which is working in a more classical sense. So getting back to the mission of this conference, where there is this thesis that there might be a new unease between architecture and philosophy. What would a relationship, we have some questions, right? What would a relationship without unease be? Like, can you imagine an easy relationship? I can't. And if there was such a thing, a relationship without unease, would you want one of those? Would you ever enter such a thing? And doesn't a relationship presuppose unease? Isn't relationship already imply some kind of tension? And in what sense is the unease structural, even foundational? It is the unease that holds the relationship as a relationship. And anyway, if I can do what I just said we shouldn't do, if I can name Derrida, wasn't that his main point? That if one could speak about main points, that the unease is structural, that it is the unease that structures. So a relationship is structured by that which appears to be uneasy. So when the conference organizers speak about a new unease, they could be speaking about just simply a new relationship, or a relationship that's finally become interesting. I mean, that's the other way to say it, that finally now, 20 years later, it starts to become more interesting. This relationship anyway, I would say, and perhaps this is just a kind of provincial arrogance of the architect to think that architecture and philosophy would be an interesting relationship. I think this relationship could not be like other relationships, and the unease between us could not be the same as others. Since architecture, another way to say to you what I was saying before about architecture's relationship to the object, architecture literally stands against unease. It is that which stands in the sight of unease. I mean, the sort of most sort of silly example would be the tombstone, which places an object that is even an image of an object in its clarity, in its right angles, and in a name. It stands in the place of that which you could never possibly imagine or understand, the loss of somebody that you love. So the object stands where you are the most uneasy, to, as it were, allow you to imagine that you are able to think about this thing which is unthinkable. Architecture, in exactly the same way, stands, always stands, only stands in the sight of the unthinkable, the unimaginable. And remember, architecture is not a bunch of objects in the world, but it's a certain way of seeing the object. So there's a certain way of seeing the object that sees it clear, sees it defined, sees it self-secure, stable, sees it standing. But this thing that you see stands exactly in the place that you cannot see, that you cannot think, that you cannot imagine. The full confidence of the city of Belgrade, war or no war, before war, against war, the image of the city that will live on, that will survive you, that will still be there. This image stands exactly in place of all of this uncertainty. If you ask an architect to design for you a house, you say, please, I would like a house that communicates to the world who I am and what my family is. Nobody on this planet wants a house that tells the world what the family is. Do you really want a house that when you're having a bad day, it says to the neighbors, we're having a bad day? Right? No, you want the house to represent an image of what a family could be or should be in the same way of our clothing. So architecture in this sense stands against unease. So an uneasy relationship between architecture and philosophy will not be the same kind of uneasy relationship as any other. Architecture, if you like, is built in the place of the unthinkable, the point of maximum, the exact point of maximum unease. It is at the very least a form of denial or repression. Architecture is a special case of denial. That's one way of understanding architecture, that it's just within the spectrum of denial, captured, I think, perfectly in the figure of the architect. Architects love buildings. We are in love with buildings, which means we don't know what they are. It's a very simple definition of an architect. Architect is the only person in our society that doesn't know what a building is. So we spend our entire life trying to understand what this amazing thing is that we don't feel we can be separated from, which is why architects don't have a life. We don't have weekends, we only talk to other architects, we speak another language. We are in love with buildings. We treat buildings the way we should treat people, but we don't. So for us, this room, of course it's a strange room, but for the architect it's full of all sorts of full of mystery. The architect's relationship to a building is like that of a child. We see buildings filled with all sorts of unknown, unspeakable potentials, and yet our field is called on to represent exactly the opposite. So large objects, buildings, are produced for our society to represent certainty and stability, and the people that are asked to produce them are the people that find buildings to be absolutely uncertain and mysterious, and they love that. So we have a field totally divided between a private love affair and a public confidence, between doubt and uncertainty and an openness to any form of knowledge in the production of the object, and then a very, very narrow constraint. When philosophy builds its arguments about thinking with an image of architecture, the image they use is this image of denial, but not understood as denial. So architecture appears in philosophy as what it is supposed to appear to in culture. That is to say, philosophy is nowhere more stupid than when it talks about architecture, because it thinks of architecture as being what it believes the advertising. Quite amazing. It doesn't think of architecture itself as unbelievably uneasy, that its statements are, its confidence is absolutely built. And by the way, none of us really know what this room is. There's no information you are receiving in this room that lets you know what this space is made of. You are living within about 1 millimeter thickness of paint, a little bit of wool, a little bit of plastic, a little bit of metal, and you have some sort of vague idea what might be there. You're in a room full of experts. You're in a room full of architects who have no idea what this room is about. So you're suspended in a totally fragile ecology. You've never been in a more kind of vulnerable state than you are here. This is a new building, by the way. So why is it that you don't think it's going to fall? You have no idea. So in this room, you are perfectly happy to suspend all thoughts about the certainty and stability of architecture in order to listen to me. But when you become philosophers, you could only think of this room as representing itself in terms of certainty. So deconstruction, starting of course with that very word, tries to grasp this intimacy between structure and unease, this kind of structural unease, this unease that structures. Derrida's challenge to philosophy reweaves, let's say, the relationship with architecture. His writing is, of course, shaped by a very close attention to the slippages along the classical chain from ground to foundation to structure and ornament, an argument which becomes inseparable from questioning the relationship between inside and outside. Of course, we know a little bit about this from the side of architecture, that the question of ornament is the question of the inside. This thinking observes the slippages which are integral to architecture yet destabilize authority. Derrida precisely describes his way of looking for whatever it is in a work that resists philosophical inquiry. So he basically says he's looking for that which resists philosophical inquiry, and then immediately says, for it is within a certain experience of spacing, of space, that resistance to philosophical authority can be produced. That is to say, he's in the end going to find that which resists philosophical authority. That will always be a question of space, and he goes on to say the question of spacing can never be separated from the question of architecture. So that is to say, at its heart, as shown so crudely by the word deconstruction, deconstruction is a kind of architectural thinking. He points out that there's no architecture without spacing, and vice versa, no spacing without architecture. So his discourse is absolutely marked by this kind of doubling, this looking for spacing within the art of space. And spacing is, of course, tied as a concept to the question of the other. The other is exactly spacing, that which spaces. This is not an undoing of architecture. It is, of course, an affirmation. Again, to quote there, deconstruction is the condition of construction. Nothing more, nothing less. It is basically an argument about the other within as the very basis of construction, of that which stands, of that which presents itself. In such an argument, architecture could never simply be an object of philosophical analysis. The staging of Eisenman Derrida, Toomey Derrida is absolutely not interesting from this point of view, although much of the writing produced in this exchange is extremely valuable. And I think the essay of Derrida about Bernard's project is one of the most interesting of his essays. And its reflections on the architecture of architecture are I think, absolutely continue to be very provocative and interesting. But let's say this was all worked out a quarter of a century ago, so here we are for the reunion to try to see what was going on. I think it's crucial to remember that the asymmetry in these couplings between architecture and philosophy, and the differences between, there's an asymmetry in these couplings, and there's a difference between, I'm sorry for the language, coupling in the streets and coupling in the university. I mean, it's just different. When the architects and philosophers agreed to collaborate on a project or agreed to attend a conference like this one, you have to remember, architecture as a discipline is still a work in progress. Its presence in the university, the home of philosophy, after all, the university is the house of philosophy. Architecture's presence in this house is still uncertain. Indeed, I think the university might dissolve before architecture finally feels itself to be fully at home in the university, and probably just before the university dissolves, it's going to look like an architecture school. And I think we're headed that way. So So when the philosopher and the architect get together in the university and talk about whatever they talk about, it's absolutely asymmetrical relationship between somebody who feels very certain of that they are at home and somebody who's made to feel other, made to feel as a guest, made to feel embarrassed, made to be, at the very least, shining the shoes of philosophy. I'm therefore much less interested in these theatrical stagings between philosophy and architecture and more in the kind of everyday slippages. And I can continue, as you can hear today, to think about exactly the same ideas of place, of ground, of authorship, of structure and ornament inside and outside, more or less as the conventional labor of an architectural theorist, not as a Derridian, but simply because architecture is really weird. I mean, if you get serious about architecture, it's a strange beast. And it's the weirdness of architecture that attracted me to Derrida's thinking in the first place. Again, that's what resonated, his understanding of the strange way in which things stand. Last week I thought I should read a little Derrida again to see if I believe everything that I've told you up to this point. That is to say that it's been, in a way, refreshing for me to, as it were, keep my distance as a gesture of respect, both to Derrida and to my own field. And I read some of his writing about the animal, and I was very struck by one of the sentences from a July 1997 lecture where he says, in an argument I'm sure you're very familiar with, he says, "No animal has ever thought to dress itself. Clothing would be proper to man, one of the properties of man. The animal therefore is not naked because it's naked, because there's no nudity in nature." I mean, it's a great argument that, of course, you know, once you have those three sentences, you need thousands more to kind of grasp it. It resonated with me for purely selfish reasons, because most of the work I've done since that time in the 80s has been to write about the idea of architecture as a form of clothing. So precisely the idea that clothing would be understood to be that which is most proper to man struck me. And precisely the understanding of architecture as a form of clothing inverts the relationship of structure and ornament. But I'm also struck by the fact that this argument could easily be repeated about orthogonal geometry, about the right angle. It's almost impossible to find right angles in the natural world, if one can refer to a natural world. Indeed, this is one way to understand what a right angle is. One way to understand what the natural world is, to say it's the place where you can't find right angles. The right angle is therefore, in a certain sense, proper to man. It is one of the properties of man. The right angle can never be as efficient structurally as curves or triangles. The universe is not made up out of right angles. It's a bad idea if you want to make a cosmos. Right angles are not very useful. So the image of structure, the right angle, the image of that which comes before excess, the image of that which is first, normal, is itself already excessive. It's already an invention, a kind of production, even a kind of ornament, even a kind of image. So you could combine the two thoughts very quickly here, and just to rush for 5 minutes. How then to understand geometry itself as a form of clothing, which for me is just to pursue again the thought of architecture as a form of clothing. I'm obsessed with this, I have to tell you. There's no reason for you to listen. Well, there hasn't been any good reason to listen up till now, but let's say there's even less reason for you to listen, so please stop listening, except what I just said. I'm very interested, for example, in Buckminster Fuller, which everybody thinks about as geometry, as reducing architecture to pure geometry, and I tried to demonstrate that there's no geometry in Buckminster Fuller that's not embedded in plastic, that plastic is actually what gives birth to geometry, that geometry, as it were, is always wearing plastic, that it's suspended in plastic. And this is not a change in direction. This idea of Derrida affecting architecture, which belittles both him and architecture, in a sense misses the point, because he is studying structure. He's interested in that which lets things stand. He's saying that standing is based on unease. And of course this first book that I encountered of grammatology is actually a relatively late book in comparison to the first on Husserl's The Origin of Geometry. And the origin of geometry, of course, just that very expression captures the possibility that, for example, the right angle could have an origin, could be, as it were, invented. Again, we have to ask the crucial question. When a philosopher refers to architecture, what is the architecture being referred to? Do we have any reason to think that the philosopher knows about architecture, is really thinking about architecture, or is just using a kind of image, even a kind of cliche? At what point should we deploy the expertise of the architect? And what do we do when that cliche image of architecture is actually organizing the philosophy? It's not appearing there as one image amongst others. Do we approach that concept of architecture with the expertise of the architect or with the philosopher's own expertise? Do we turn architecture from a kind of prop for the argument to the subject of the argument? And once you pull on that thread, it all unravels. Let's go back quickly to Husserl's 1936 text that Derrida is writing about, 1962. For example, that text almost immediately differentiates the ideal objectivity of geometry, like all science, from, quoting Husserl, the tools of architectural and other such products. So his very first gestures say, what we're going to talk about here is not architecture. He says, you know, in architecture, you can, like with any other tool, you can repeat something in many, many cases. Geometry is never simply repeated, it's always actually the same thing. It's ideal in that sense. Geometry only happens once, he says, no matter how many times and which language you express it, therefore it's not architecture, apparently. But almost immediately, literally 2 paragraphs later, when he's differentiated the ideal objects of geometry and science from architectural objects, he describes those ideal objects using the language of building. In other words, his way of explaining what this non-architectural thing is to use architecture. He says, geometry is an ideal structure, a mental structure, a particular construction. It has a basis, it has a foundation, and most importantly, it has a history, such that, as he puts it, every researcher works on his part of the building, and no building block within the mental structure is sufficient, such that geometry is a, quote, systematic, endlessly growing, stratified structure of idealities. And of course, his main argument is, since it has a history, this seemingly trans-historical thing, geometry, since it actually has a history, it can always be reactivated, and in fact has to be reactivated. So basically Husserl goes out of his way to leave architecture behind, then immediately architecture is the best, even the only way for him to describe what it is that architecture is leaving behind. The architecture that he's leaving, what's being left behind. This is a very complex desire. He wants to recover the origin of an ideal construction that leaves actual construction behind, but he's unable to leave the image of actual construction behind. And images are supposed to be a big problem. Derrida, as you know, writes his first book about this because he's super fascinated by Husserl's point that geometry must be written down in order to be reactivated, that there's no origin, no beginning of geometry without writing. As architects, we may read this text a little bit differently. We might be equally fascinated by Husserl's opposition to drawing. Husserl complains about elementary geometry books that, quote, render the concepts sensibly intuitable by means of drawn figures substituted for the actual production of idealities. In other words, the drawing of lines, like geometric lines, is but a substitute that blocks thinking. So his argument for writing is also an argument against drawing, and Husserl's text concludes that the origin of geometry requires that the lived world, the beginning of geometry, it requires that the lived world has already been transformed into shapes, figures, surfaces, lines, angles, points, and straight lines, he says, are especially preferred. This, quote, art of measurement is, as he puts it, always already there, always abundantly developed and pre-given to the philosopher who did not yet know geometry but would be only conceivable as its inventor. That is to say, the mythical figure that invents geometry can only invent it if the world has been turned into a drawing. But drawing itself must be left behind. Husserl's example is not by chance the art of design for buildings. So the art of design for buildings, the drawing of a building, is a precondition for geometry, but is also, as you remember, his very first example of what geometry is not. The space of the lived world has to have been converted into an image, a kind of drawing, to become the material, the base for these new constructions of pure thinking. So geometry requires the image of architecture. Architecture is image, but equally requires it to be left behind. Geometry is precisely a leaving behind of architecture. The philosopher, to finish, likewise requires a certain image of architecture, even the idea of architecture as providing a certain image. And and I think it is he, requires architecture to be left behind. But what is never left behind is the image itself, this very, very particular understanding of architecture as tool, as ground, foundation, structure, ornament, and so on. Deconstruction, even the very term, is precisely the consequence of folding the philosopher's thinking back onto the very image that props that thinking up. Derrida's introduction to Husserl's text is not about this. It actually precedes the word deconstruction, which arrives much more fully in off-grammatology. It is, as it were, this text on Husserl is, as it were, the construction side of deconstruction. But it is an argument that will allow Derrida to think architecture differently. Not by chance is Derrida's thought mainly about spacing, mainly about the other always within, and spacing as a form of architecture. If one can speak about the origin of deconstruction as a kind of building site, as a kind of, let's say, deconstruction site, it's precisely a site in which architecture is not left behind. My only point here is that the unease between architecture and philosophy is not greater or less today. It will never be more or less. The unease continues, like all forms of unease, to structure the relationship. Architecture is no more able to leave philosophy behind than philosophy can leave architecture behind. Likewise, Derrida is not left behind. His remarkable work is celebrated by work that never refers to him. Why this quiet solidarity with Derrida's thought? Why is this important? It's important because, and this I suppose is my main point here today, the attempt to leave architecture behind within philosophy that quietly monumentalizes a particular banal image of architecture as stable, grounded, defined, articulate, etc. This is not simply a habit, a kind of structural habit of philosophy. This maneuver is endlessly repeated within architectural discourse itself. So much of architectural discourse is devoted to making architecture less interesting. It's the job of architecture schools. Architecture has internalized the philosophical desire to leave architecture behind. So the real pleasure of being with you here today is not simply to think about the ongoing dance of architecture and philosophy, but to remind ourselves of the fact that our own field is very weird. Thank you.
Yeah, I will also need the other microphone to go to the audience floor, please. So do you have any questions for our speaker? Just before the microphone arrives to the audience, I will, if you can ask a question, Mark, explain it to your...
Okay. Yeah.
Just a second.
That was amazing, set of issues that were raised in Mark's talk. You know, pivotal, seminal. Is it on? Yeah. So, in a way, I have a simple question that is maybe too local for the scope of your discussion. But my simple question is, are we in architecture dangerously approaching a moment where we're no longer embarrassed by philosophy, and that because of that, that lack of encounter or that lack of engagement, that let's say such a conference as this would be trying to revitalize, no, I don't know what the aims are, but whatever, that could revitalize some of that engagement. Is that significant, that we are no longer embarrassed by philosophy in most aspects of contemporary architectural practice, and increasingly so, let's say?
Yes. Of course, I want to agree with the thought that a kind of unembarrassed architecture is not a positive outcome. So I think that architects make a kind of a contract with our society by which we keep secret what we really like about buildings, and we continue to offer people the image of the building that they want. So I think, were we to lose the embarrassment, that is to say, lose the desire to keep these things secret, there may not be a field anymore. So I think in that sense, I think there's a kind of cultish aspect to architecture, and I never, having said that, I think it is a bit boring for architects to always feel that philosophers are thinking more carefully. You know, you end up knowing too many philosophers to think that that's true. By which I mean, philosophy is also nervous about its project, and you could also understand Derrida's thinking as bringing to the surface the kind of unease that is also hanging around philosophy a lot. So I think that the philosopher's mission to think very carefully and to think carefully about thinking is also a nervous project. And so I think the staging of the architect's embarrassment and the staging of the philosopher's confidence, it can be useful to sort of play with that and to confuse that. I have yet to see a philosopher truly humble in the face of architecture, and I've not seen yet an architect supremely confident in the face of philosophy. I mean, we haven't reached that point yet, but I would say yes. If we reach that point, it's really, really going to be boring from that point on.
Do we have another question? Perhaps on the back of the room? Okay, a simple one. How to let non-architectural ideas into the architecture? Related to the first part of Mark's presentation, the role of the drawing.
Well, I don't think there are non-architectural ideas. And there could be two explanations of why I feel that way. One is that I'm an architect, so I just imagine that everything is in my world. So it's just the arrogance of the discipline to assume that anything that would constitute an idea would be therefore architectural. But there's also the possibility that the word idea, even to say it crudely, when Plato tries to explain the concept of idea, or the idea of the idea, he says, think of the person who makes a house. First they have the idea of the house, and then they make the house. So so from a more sort of fundamental point of view, ideas and architecture are you could never separate that. Well, I suppose what you mean is how through drawing to admit ideas which are outside of the domain of the architect or the philosopher into the space of the object. And I think this is also a theoretical position that architecture has been called on to represent the possibility of absorbing things from the outside. The idea that a building could be filled with an idea is already the thought that architecture has the capacity to receive from the outside. So so maybe the more technical way to answer your question is when you make the argument that it is the other within, the other inside is what allows the inside to be an inside. There is only ever, with the drawing of the line, there's only ever what you ask for, which is the other coming in. Now, with our architects, let's say, receptive to this extraordinary maneuver, I don't know. Society is really not asking architects to think about architecture. It's not like, my argument is not that architects are really thinking about architecture and they're doing a good job and nobody loves them enough, and the philosopher is not thinking carefully enough about architecture and should listen to the architect. Our language even asks us not to think too much about the object. Because if you do, what you get is something that might be referred to as deconstruction. You end up not sure. And so I think you could say, I would say there is this I'm speaking too long, but there is this contract by which we don't pay attention to the fact that there is only ever the other within. So the answer to your question is it's happening all the time, regardless of whether the architect wants it or not.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for only one more question, or we're going to wrap up. Where is running a little bit late, so we are going to wrap up. Thank you very much.